So I want to start by saying thank you everyone for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about lofts and Onshape. And I really wanted to give you kind of a thorough overview of how you can get lofts accomplished in Onshape. Some things to know, some commands that may help, and also some things to look out for. So I really wanted to create kind of a comprehensive webinar discussing as much detail as we can the topic of lofts. Now we probably won't use the entire hour, so feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. I always say that with these webinars. We really encourage you to ask any questions. There's a questions dialog in your GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to type in anything, and I'll do my best to stop and address the questions as we go through this. Also on the line with me is Ethan. Ethan can help out with any questions as well, so he's going to be helping me make sure that anything you have to ask is addressed. So let's dig in. Now, again, topic lofts and Onshape, really intended for those that maybe have just a bit more experience, some time using the extrude, the revolve, and the sweep command, and you're ready for something a little bit more elaborate, a little bit more complex. So let's jump into it. Now, when I talk about lofts in general, I do have somewhat of an agenda for today. And the main thing with this webinar that I want to do is, of course, introduce everyone to the loft command. So assuming you have no experience with a loft, how do I get started? How do I create the basic geometry? Where do I go? What options are there? So introduce you to the loft command. That's, of course, the main goal for today. So if you have a lot of exposure to it, and at least getting started here may be just a little bit slow, I do want to start with a simple example for those that are not familiar. So we'll start with a simple example, and then I want to get into some of the options that are available for the loft command. So guides, in conditions, and all the various things that can help you get the exact shape that you're looking for. Now, throughout all of this, throughout the whole webinar, really, I like to point out just little tips and tricks. So things that I just want to mention that may help you create a successful loft. All right, so let's jump into it. A question that's popped up. When lofts fail, there's very little feedback to let you know why something didn't work. And my workaround has been to just try different things. And, I will say that this is an area that we're hoping to improve, in general, the error reporting. When you do see a feature fail, you can hover over it to get the feedback, but we are working on improving that message that you get in situations like that. Okay, so this is the rough agenda. As I mentioned before, we probably won't use the whole hour, so feel free to ask any questions as we're going through this. But let's dig in. Now, the question has often come up, and it's, of course, a very valid one. What exactly is a loft? And at least in our definition of it, it's a smooth transition between profiles that you select. Now, these profiles can be closed contours within a sketch. They can be non-planar faces. You have your options in terms of what the profiles are. But essentially what it does is it allows you to transition from one shape to another shape given the selections you've chosen, your profiles. And this can be particularly useful if you're trying to create organic or hard to create shapes, things that you really don't have a good way of using extrude, revolve, or sweep to accomplish. The thing to keep in mind about a loft command is a lot of times it's more complex than the counterparts would be, the extrude, revolve, and sweep. Now, of course, you can create a simple loft, and I don't want to make it sound overly complicated. But in many situations, it is the tool you resort to when you really need that very specific shape that you can't easily get with one of the other standard tools. So really useful in creating those organic, I call it organic shapes, but really if you're concerned about curvature or any of those types of things, this is the tool that you often resort to. So that's, loft in a nutshell, a smooth transition between profiles that you select. Now, before we get into actually creating some lofts, I do have a few tips to get you started. And these are just a few frequently asked questions, things that I always like to tell new users about the loft command in general. The first, and it's a frequently asked question, can you have more than 2 profiles in your loft? And the answer is absolutely. You can have as many profiles as you would like. However, they need to be selected in order when you're creating your loft. And I'm going to show you an example of this in just a bit, so don't worry if this isn't clear. But if you're going through and selecting your loft command, you need to make sure to select the profiles in the order that you want to loft between. You don't want to jump around in terms of your profiles. And this is, of course, if you have more than 2. Profiles cannot have nested contours. This is something that often trips up a new user. The profile cannot have any closed contours within that profile. And I'll show you an example of this in just a bit. Also very cool, and something I like to point out, is you can loft between non-planar faces. I have an example of this, but this really allows you to do things like match the surrounding curvature or tangent to the surrounding curvature. You can actually match the surrounding faces with something like a match curvature option. And that is useful if you're lofting between faces rather than sketch entities, of course. The last tip that I have is you do not need the same number of vertices on each profile. It will help tremendously in how the vertices are matched between the loft contours, but it is not a requirement, which means a lot of times by default when you create a loft, you may well see a lot of twists, what we refer to as twist in the loft. The loft gives you kind of a funny shape, and it's because it doesn't know how to correctly map the vertices from each profile. I'm going to give you an example of this, so forgive me if this is a little over the top. I'm going to show you what each of these things mean in just a second. But these are just some general rules. If I had to leave you with one thing, these are just some general rules if you're getting started with a loft command. Question: is there a way to reorder profiles that have already been selected? Unfortunately, no. I don't believe we have a way besides obviously deleting and reselecting. Can you control what vertices line up? Forgive me. When we're referring to the transition between contours, absolutely. So if you're referring to what I was talking about a moment ago, where you do not need the same number of vertices, we do have a method, a way to get them to correctly line up. And I'm going to go over it in just a bit. It's the splitting of the sketch entities to match. So these are just some general rules to get started. I have a few examples of showing you how to do things like control twist and so on. But let's jump into it. Now, again, as I mentioned before, I really do want to start simple. So for those not familiar with the command at all, I just want to walk you through how to create a basic loft. And I think the best way to do that is just to start from scratch. Now, it's important to keep in mind we're transitioning between profiles. So the first step, of course, is to create your profile. Now, you can use faces of models, for example, or other features. But in my case, I'm going to start from scratch with two simple ellipses. All right, so I'll select ellipse, and we'll sketch a basic ellipse and add some simple dimensions. Okay. So let's say 2.5. So I've created a basic ellipse. Now what I'd like to do is loft this ellipse to another larger ellipse out in front of this front plane and an offset from this front plane. And you can easily do that, but the important thing is creating that construction plane. So one of the biggest tips that I can give, and it's not necessarily with the loft command, but you use it a lot when you're creating lofts, is inserting construction planes. Okay, real quickly, are you going to discuss loft transitions of 4 points to 3 points? I will discuss loft transitions of vertices that do not match and how you can split them up to make them match. So I will show you an example of that. Okay, so I mentioned before I wanted to take a simple ellipse and loft it to another larger ellipse. I can use the construction plane command. You'll see plane here in the toolbar. And I can use the front plane as my reference. That's where I initially sketched my ellipse. We'll do a simple 2-inch offset for the plane, green check, and now I've inserted a construction plane that I can then sketch my ellipse on. Now, one of the biggest tips that I can give you today, and it's especially if you're creating more complex shapes, is the copy sketch and the paste sketch capabilities. If you're doing loft contours, oftentimes they can be very similar. Not always, but oftentimes, if I want to create, for instance, a bottle-like shape that was, just a series of changing ellipses, I can copy and paste the sketch and save myself from having to sketch that ellipse over and over again. So just a tip, you can right-click, copy a sketch, and paste that sketch onto another plane. All right. Now, there's a few benefits to this, but I want to point out one big one, and that is you just simply don't have to go back and sketch it over and over again. I do want to point out, though, it is not constrained in any way. It's not derived in the sense. It's not linked to the original. Useful for things like lofts, where I may want to change the value some, may not be useful in other scenarios. So I do want to point that out. When you do the copy and paste like I did there, the two are not linked. Right? So this is underdefined until I go back and constrain it. But now I've got these two contours, real simple ones. I just want a loft. I want a gradual transition from this ellipse to this ellipse. Right? I can select the loft command from the toolbar. You'll see it here in the far left. And then I just select my profiles. In this case, this ellipse and this one. So that creates a simple transition between those two profiles. Okay? Probably the simplest example of a loft I can give you. I do want to point out a few things with this in general. One of the first is that, in this case, it's completely controlled by the command itself. The transition from this ellipse to this ellipse is controlled by the default settings of the loft command. But you can control that shape. I'm going to go over that in just a bit. So just keep that in mind. You can create a transition that's more subtle, or you can create a transition that's more sharp. You have that kind of control. Now, one thing I want to point out is this is a loft between two profiles, two ellipses. So a tip that I have for you is you don't have to have just two profiles. You can have as many as you'd like. So let's delete that loft. I want to insert another plane off of the last one, this time again 2 inches. And again, I want to copy the sketch and paste it onto the sketch plane. Okay. So now I have 3 separate sketches, and if I go in and edit sketch 3, I can transition. Let's go back down to, let's say, a 5 and a 2. Right. And so now I can transition back down to a smaller ellipse, go back to my loft command, and just loft between now 3 profiles. Okay. So the key thing there is, you can loft between as many profiles as you'd like. It's just a matter of creating, in this case, those sketch entities, and then lofting between them, selecting them. Notice that I selected them in order. And what I mean by that is I did not select the first, then the last, and then the middle. Okay, that will cause the loft to fail. So very important to point out, make sure as you're going through and selecting your lofts, select them in the correct order. Okay. And it doesn't matter whether you go left to right or right to left. In this case, you get the same end result. You just want to make sure to select them in a certain order. Quick questions, a few questions. Why is it a curved guide, not a straight one? When you select more than one profile, it's going to, really, if you select 2 profiles, it's going to give you a smooth transition between the shapes, not a straight transition between the shapes. That's the idea behind it, is it gives you a smooth transition between curvature, not a sharp transition, I would say. Forgive me if I'm misunderstanding that question. In other programs, you have some constraints based off the start of geometry and end point of the geometry. Are there some constraints within Onshape besides these points of origin can get messy quickly? You do have constraints within the loft command itself, and I'm going to go over that in just a bit. And in the case of end conditions and guides, that give you a little bit more control over these shapes, if I'm understanding your question correctly. I'm going to go over those options in just a bit. I would like to do the loft not on the same center line. Okay, I'll show you an example of this in just a moment, so bear with me. Okay, so this has come up twice now. Is it possible to loft sketches together that are off axis from another, meaning that if the sketch was right of the original by 3 inches, would the loft naturally adapt? So let's get into another example that I have for this. In fact, let's just delete these. And I know there are a few other questions, so bear with me. But this one has come up a few times, so I do want to address it. I showed you a simple example where we went from a series of ellipses, and they just were 3 ellipses that got larger or smaller, and you just select the profiles. Important to keep in mind, select them in order. But of course, you could do a lot more with a loft, so let's do something like a simple center rectangle, right? And I want to loft to, let's say, offset away from this a certain distance. Let's offset away, let's say 4 inches. And I want to offset to a circle. Now, initially, I'm going to put this on the origin just to show the capability, but I will shift it. I'll show you that in just a moment. So let's place the circle on the center, right? 4. Real simple shape, and I want to create a loft between these 2 shapes, right? So I have my 2 sketches, one a rectangle, one a circle. Let's loft between those 2, okay? Now, initially when you do this, it looks very good, and when the 2 share the same center, it does a very good job of mapping the points correctly. It's not perfect, but it's good. You don't have to, oftentimes in simple situations like this, adjust it. But you can do transitions from something like a rectangle to something like a circle, and notice that I didn't have to split up the entities. I didn't have to go through and specify, this is where I want things to align. So it will by default allow you to loft between contours or profiles that don't have the same number of vertices. And this is a good example of that. However, what happens if they are not perfectly aligned, right? So let's go in and delete my constraint, shift this up, right? And add an offset. Let's go 1.5. Now, in this case, we may not get the correct twist or the twist that I would expect by default, right? So if we do a loft now, because the 2 are not shared, you'll notice I get some twist in the loft. The main thing I want to point out about this, and it will happen from time to time, is that don't let the twist scare you. It's an easy thing to address, but I think this will throw a lot of new users off. They just click 2 faces, and ooh, that looks ugly. I'll find something else. It's easy. It's an easy problem to correct. So I do want to point this out. But by default, again, you can loft between the contours, but you may not get the exact twist that you're trying to. So let me show you an example of what I might do in this situation. So in this case, what I'd like to do is I'd like to map certain points in the circles to the corners. And the easiest way to do that is with the sketch split. So in this case, in the sketch toolbar, while in the sketch for this circle, I can select split and split this circle into pieces. Now, I'm not going to go through all the time of constructing this, so forgive me, but you can even construct construction lines and map those points to the construction lines and really build a lot of design intent in. But in my case, I'm going to keep it simple. We'll split here and here. Okay? And now you'll notice this is a separate piece from the rest of the circle. In this case, it's actually 2 arcs now. So now split here and here. And again, I'm just kind of placing these points. In your case, you would probably want to go through and constrain it. What I've seen a lot of users do is actually draw in construction geometry. That's a common technique. But now, just that simple split, which split my circle into 4 pieces, now each loft profile has the same number of vertices. The key difference here is when you go to loft, it will now recognize those points. So in this case, you'll see I have a lot less twist, and the contours are matching the points that I selected. So it's going through and automatically mapping them. So if you have the same number of vertices on each sketch profile, you have a much cleaner loft transition. Just keep that in mind. Okay. A few questions. Forgive me. I know I'm a bit behind here. And by the way, I will stick around and answer any questions. So forgive me if I don't get to yours. Just stick around and I'll make sure to answer them as best I can. Although I know, okay, so I'm making lofts similar to elliptical shapes, but the lofts make a knife edge in places. Although I need the knife edge to be thicker in order to 3D print it probably. Do you have any suggestions preventing the loft from creating knife edges between faces? I will say there are two techniques if you're trying to create very slim profiles for lofts, and one is lofting to a point, which you can do. In the case of surface lofts, you can create a loft to a point, for example. And you can also thicken. So keep in mind all the loft commands I'm showing you. There's a surface alternative, which will create a single, single surface instead of having any thickness or being a solid body like I am here. And you can offset or thicken that. So those are two techniques I might look at. If you wanted a sharp corner at the middle of the ellipse, could you create two lofts, one from each side? Absolutely, yes. How do you make a new plane and offset in degrees to make a wedge shape? In general, the plane command, the command I would look for is line angle. That will allow you to insert an angle by a reference line. So I think the answer to the prior question is contour touches the faces normal to the faces. And we do have some functionality I'm going to show you in a bit to match contours of surrounding faces. So if that's what you're referring to, again, forgive me if it's not. I tried doing a circle to square loft where the two faces are 90 degrees to one there and an offset. When you do something with 90 degrees, it's important to keep in mind it's going directly from one to another. So it may be worth considering creating one intermediate plane halfway through and constructing the transition between the two there. Is there a way to do 3D sketches for guide curves? As of today, no. And that's something we realized is important to users. We do not have a 3D sketch capability today. Now, that doesn't stop you from creating guides. It's just they cannot be 3D sketches. I'm going to show you an example of guides in just a bit. Is there a limit to the number of shapes you can loft together? I'm not aware of one. I don't think we have a hard limit, at least not one that I'm aware of. But I suspect it would be more than most users would hit. When you demonstrate a spiral loft, that may will be bell-shaped loft from 0 scale to... Forgive me, I'm not sure I understand the question there. All right. Let's move on. Now, I will get to the questions. I know there are many there, so forgive me. I know I'm not getting to all of them now, but I will get to some of them, if anything, at the very end, so forgive me. All right, so I've covered the basics of splitting the sketch entity up, and the sketch split command will be a very useful one for creating the more complex loft shapes. When you're trying to map, certain vertices of certain shapes, if they have the same number of vertices in each sketch profile, you have a much cleaner transition, and you can effectively control the points that get matched when it goes to create the loft. So that's one of the first big tips that I can give you is when you're doing something like this, make sure to split, or at least a best practice would be to split the sketch entity or sketch into multiple pieces. Okay. All right, so I mentioned this a moment ago, and I do want to point this out. No nested contours. Nested contours is a limitation, and it's something I run into a lot with new users, so I do want to point it out. Just bear with me for a moment here. Let's create, again, something like a simple ellipse. Okay. All right, I want a simple ellipse. Let's give it a few dimensions. Say 6 and 8. So I've got this basic ellipse shape, right? And I want to create another plane off of this one. Let's do this 3 inches away. And again, I just want to create another simple ellipse. So not a complex loft, very similar to what I was showing you a moment ago. The key thing that I want to point out, and this is something that often new users will run into, is you cannot have a nested contour. And the question then comes up, well, what is a nested contour? If I loft between these two ellipses, I get the loft behavior that I might expect. What I want to point out about this is, if, for instance, this sketch had another closed contour within the sketch, let's say that I put another circle inside of this sketch, you cannot loft this sketch as it is. And I want to point that out because it's something that a lot of users will run into. If I select loft and I select this face, I cannot use it to loft between the two faces. So yet you can, you still use this sketch. You'll need to convert this to construction geometry or just delete it and put it into another sketch. Important to point out, you must have one closed loop, so to speak, one closed contour. You cannot have, in this case, what would be referred to as a nested contour, a circle within the ellipse. But it can be any enclosed loop within an enclosed loop cannot be used for a loft. Okay. So definitely something I wanted to point out. Make sure that your loft profiles, if they're sketch entities, consist of only one closed loop. All right, so moving on, let's get into a few more examples. Okay, so what if I want more control? And this is something I wanted to get into in particular with the shape of it. So up to this point, we just select two different contours and it lofts between them. But what if I wanted to control the shape of that transition between contours? That's where we start to get into the topic of guides and in conditions. Now, bear with me just a moment. I want to go back to the slides for just a second here. Other useful commands. I've shown you two already. I'll show you the other two in just a moment. Sketch split is going to be a big one. The split command in sketching allows you to split your contours or your profiles up into the same number of vertices. So probably one of the biggest tips is that split command while sketching. Now, the other one is feature split. I'm going to show you an example of this in just a bit, but we're talking about lofting between non-planar faces, things that aren't perfectly flat. Splitting faces up makes it very easy to determine what I want to loft between. Now, the other one that I've already pointed out is construction plane. Construction plane allows you to insert that offset plane. Now, the other one that I want to point out is the multi-plane custom feature. And I think this, if you're doing a lot of complex lofts, can be a very valuable. This is actually a custom feature written by our own Lou Gallo. If you haven't heard of it, this was just recently announced, so I just want to point this out. The example I showed you a moment ago, I had to insert two different planes. Well, you can imagine if I have a more complex loft, I may need to insert a dozen planes. And, there's lots of complex shapes out there that may require a lot of, very smooth transition between shapes. And so the example I like to give with this is, what if I wanted a dozen planes, all evenly spaced? Do I need to do them one at a time? With this custom feature, you can actually go in and select a face, for instance, the top plane, and say, I want, 12 planes at 2 inches apart. And you'll see it creates offset planes all in one shot. Okay. So this is probably one of the big tips that I have, with custom features. This is a newly announced feature, but especially for those doing complex shapes, if you're doing really complex lofts that require a lot of planes, this will allow you to insert them all at once. You can even set the size, especially important if you're working with a shape and you want to be able to see the boundary of the edges of the plane to make it easy to select. So you can set the number of planes, the distance between planes, and the size of the plane, and then they're all there now for you to start sketching your geometry. Okay. So this is a big tip that I have now. Also with this command, you can select something like a curve. So I could say curve point and select an edge, for instance, and then say I want 12 evenly spaced planes along that edge. So even for the more complex shapes where you're really trying to, get this very specific shape, you can go in and add a whole series of planes and then give yourself all those points to create loft profiles. So a big tip that I have, for those users out there is this multi-plane feature. For the loft command, I think it's an invaluable one, complex lofts especially. Now to find this, you can add it. It's a custom feature. So on the far right, you have add custom feature. There's feature script samples, and you can browse down. There's a few different samples that are worth checking out, but you'll see multi-plane is one of them. This will add it as an icon to your toolbar, by the way. So if you do a lot of that type of work, it might be worth checking out this custom feature. Okay, so that's a few features that I wanted to highlight. Sketch split, I've already shown you an example of. Feature split, I will. Construction planes and constructing them is a very important part. And the multi-plane custom feature kind of makes that a lot easier. Now, some tips. Let's get into them. Now, I want to go over guides and in conditions. So we're going to go over guides in just a bit. I'm jumping ahead just a bit here. I want to first go over in conditions and the various examples where you might use the different in conditions. So here's a similar example to what we had before, and I just want to create a simple loft between the three circles. Now, this shape, as I mentioned before, is determined by the loft command itself, but what if I wanted a sharper transition between contours? Or what if I wanted a more broad transition between contours? What if I want to tweak the way this looks in general? What options do I have? And really, it's two. You have guides and in conditions. Okay? So you can select, in this case, in conditions, and then specify the in condition that you want. The neat thing about in conditions is that it allows you to drastically change the shape of your loft with little effort. You don't have to construct guides, which is the more manual and tedious effort. Now, in this case, I can say something like normal to profile, and notice that the shape now remains normal to the sketch profile for a longer period before it transitions into the next profile. And you can specify this for both a start and end definition, right? So now I'm at both start and end, maintaining that normal to profile direction for longer than I would with the standard loft command. Now you can also control the magnitude of this. So if I want to specify, no, I want 2, this is a magnitude of 2, it will maintain that distance even longer. The reason I bring these up first is they're the easiest. In conditions, very easy to try out and see what happens and not have to invest a lot of time in constructing geometry. So normal to profile, very easy. You choose it. It maintains that normal direction for a longer period of time before it transitions to the next profile. Now, there are, of course, other options in here. One of them I like to point out is tangent to profile. And this will actually ensure that the loft is tangent to the, in this case, sketch plane, until it transitions. And again, you can control that magnitude. Right? So I can go back to 1 and you'll see it's only tangent for a while and then it transitions. So you can have it normal to profile, tangent to profile. You also have match tangent and match curvature, especially when we're talking about lofting between faces, or especially non-planar faces, more complex lofts. These two are particularly helpful. So that's one of my biggest tips with regards to how to change the shape of your loft. In conditions and the normal to profile, tangent to profile, match tangent, and match curvature. Okay. Now, I mentioned using non-planar faces. And I do want to point this out, as I think it's a particularly useful example. Up to this point, I've shown you a whole series of 2D sketch profiles, but your geometry may not always be that way. You may have, I want a loft between this face and that face, for example. And this gives you a unique benefit in that you could now say, I want to match the surrounding geometry to the face that I've selected. And so here's a simple example that I have where, in this case, I'm using the face as a reference to generate the loft. And if you look closely, the loft is actually following the curvature of the face. So it's maintaining the curvature of the face until it has to transition up to the second profile. And this means that I can create real simple, easy lofts that really match the surrounding geometry. So let me walk you through how you might do this. I'm going to jump back just a bit, and I want to show you how this process might take place. And one of the first tips that I have for you is the split feature. I've already shown you the split in the sketch command, but the split feature is also valuable because it allows you to split a face into pieces. So for instance, I mentioned before, you can select any face, even a non-planar face like this one, and loft. You can use that as one of the profiles for the loft. However, it's important to point out, when you do this, you're selecting the entire face. What if I wanted only a small part of this face and I want to loft between that and another circle, for example? That's where split can come in handy. Now, the split command, you'll see here in my list, split 1, all it does, right here in the toolbar, by the way, is it takes this circle that I sketched just above the face and it splits this face using that circle. And so now I have two faces, this face and the surrounding face. And the reason I did that is now I have one easy face to loft between. Okay? So a big tip that I have, if you're trying to create faces or lofts between faces, splitting that face up will allow you a lot of control over what you're lofting between. If you just simply select the whole face, of course, that's a much different shape. Right? Now, if I go all the way down here, what I want to point out is because I've now used, if I edit my loft here, the face, in this case, of extrude 50, which is, again, a non-planar face, I can match the curvature. And that's the big thing I want to point out. It will match the surrounding curvature of existing faces or whatever may be surrounding that geometry. You have match curvature and match tangent. Okay, so depending on the complexity and how detailed you need the transition between shapes, right? What type of continuity between surfaces do you need? But match curvature, match tangent allow you to select, or to create that really smooth transition between a face and maybe a sketch entity, like in this example, or even a face and another face. Okay. So that's match curvature, and again, the key thing is it just gives you that matching or blending between the face you've selected and the surrounding faces. All right, so those are the end conditions. I've mentioned normal to profile, tangent to profile. Those are pretty straightforward. The match tangent, match curvature allow you to use surrounding faces and really create a smooth transition between them. But what if even those don't give you what you're looking for? What if, even given all of these options, I still don't get the exact shape that I need? And that's really where guides come into play. And guides are particularly useful if you have, if you've done everything else and it still isn't exactly what you want, you can construct guides and tell it exactly what you want. Now, I'll be the first to admit this is not the fastest way to create a loft. You're going to spend more time constructing this geometry, but it is the way to give you the most control. You're literally drawing in the contour that it will follow as it's transitioning between profiles. Now, a few tips for guides. They are essentially sketch entities, sketches. So you must constrain them. You must attach them to the profiles, to each profile. So if we have dozens of profiles, you need to make sure that your guide is attached to each one of those profiles. You can use coincident, you can use Pierce. In many situations, they're identical, but it's important to point out you must attach the guides to the profiles, to the profiles for your loft. Now, the guide itself must be smooth. And when I say that, it has to be tangent transitions between shapes. And that means I can't use 2 lines, for example, as a guide. I need to have some kind of arc that makes that transition smooth. So just tip for guides, you must make them smooth. The last tip that I have for guide is the final button. While editing sketches can really be a valuable thing when you're creating guides in a loft. Oftentimes when you're creating a guide, it's hard to visualize what the end result will be. So you're kind of constructing this shape that you think might be right. Then you go to create the guide or the loft, use your guides, and it's not quite right. You can go into your sketch and manipulate the sketch, the guide sketch, and dynamically watch the loft update, which is a very valuable thing to getting it just right. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, I mentioned before, they must be constrained in a certain way and they must be smooth. And I do have an example of this that I want to point out. So this is, again, a very simple shape. It's the shape we had earlier. But in this, I have this sketch. And if I just take a look at this sketch, initially it looks very simple, just 2 lines, and they even look constrained properly. If I look at them, they're all coincident to other sketch geometry. So they are constrained. The thing that I wanted to point out with this is not a smooth transition between profiles. These 2 lines create a sharp transition, and that will not be usable for a guide. And so what I mean is when I go to select loft, right, and I select my profiles, of course I get the standard loft, and then I choose the option for guides, which I mentioned, and then just select the guide. Now, in this case, and another big tip that I have for guides is you don't, in general, want to select the guides from the graphics, especially if you have more than one entity. If you have just one entity, then that's fine. But if you have a lot of lines and arcs, or one big spline, or a combination of splines, I should say, it's best to select them from the feature list. That will grab all the edges. Now, in my case, as I mentioned before, because our transition is sharp, it's going to fail. Right? We need a gradual transition between them. So I'm going to X out of the loft, and let's roll down to the correct loft guide. One thing I want to point out, the main difference here, if we take a look at this sketch, is notice the arc. There's now an arc between the two lines. So there's a tangent transition between these two sketch entities. That is a very important bit as we're going through this. So now when I do the loft and I select my profiles, I choose my guide and select the correct loft guide, I do get the manipulating, right? It's following the shape of that guide. So now I'm rather than using normal profile or any other in condition option, I'm explicitly telling it follow this contour with the loft. Now, one thing I want to point out is notice that it's not symmetric, and that's a common misconception when we first get started. You just need one guide. And an example like this, if I wanted a symmetric profile, I would need two separate guides. So one thing I want to point out again, when you add a guide like this, it only manipulates the side of the piece of the loft that is attached to. Okay? And in that case, it just means that if I go all the way down here, I have a second guide that controls the upper shape, right? And then when I go to loft, I can select my profiles, right, guides, and select both guide sketches. Okay? And now I get that symmetric behavior like you might expect. So again, guides do give you a lot of control. Now I'm very explicitly stating what I want the transition to look like between profiles. But of course, they need to be sketched, which is an additional step. And you can have as many guides as you'd like, so you can create complex shapes. You can, and this is a question that's come up, copy and paste. You can copy and paste as well, and that's an easy way to save time when you're creating multiple guides. So, can you look at the loft top down? I could absolutely just choose the front from the view cube here. Now I'm looking at it top down. But again, big tip for guides, make sure that you have a tangent transition if you have more than one entity. And make sure to select it from the feature list. That's just a best practice. It's not a requirement. If you have one entity, you can select it from the graphics. What I think often users will do, though, is they'll select guides and then they'll click on a line. The way this is interpreted is this is the entire guide. And that's oftentimes not what the user is trying to do. So in this case, you select, just a tip, select the sketches from the feature list. That just saves you a lot of time. Okay. All right, so that is a simple example of guides. And I just, again, want to stress, and I didn't mention this, I didn't show this very carefully, but I do want to point this out. Each one of these profiles is attached to each one of these guides is attached to the profile. So you'll see this coincident constraint. That is actually attaching this line to that sketch entity. In this case, the circle from before. Very important to point out, make sure that your guides are attached either with coincident or pierce to those points on your sketch. Okay. All right, and if you look closely, just a bit of an aside here, just another tip. I've actually added 2 points to this circle. And it just makes it easier for me to reference when I go and sketch in my guides. Just a kind of a tip for those doing more complex shapes with a lot of guides. If you actually add points to your sketch entities, it just makes it for an easy reference when you go to construct your guides later. All right, so let's take all of this and a final example, kind of put it together. What can I do with something like this besides these simple type of shapes? And one of the examples I like to give is my squeegee. And it's a few lofts that, although they look very simple, can create a complex shape. And so this is the finished result. And if we go back, I have a copy of it where it's just rolled back. And I wanted to start at the beginning because it's important to point out the guides really do have a large impact. So if you looked at the squeegee, and in particular the handle of the squeegee, it's really just a single loft between two circles with a guide that gives you those grooves for the finger. And that guide is just a simple spline. Right? I can control it, I can manipulate it, and so on. So I select Loft, I select the two profiles, and then I can say, okay, I want guides. Now, it just so happens in this case, the guides are one entity. I can select them from the graphics. Right? So in this case, one line, one spline controls the shape. Notice again that I'm not getting that symmetric behavior. So it's not rotating those finger grooves all the way around and mirroring them to the other side, which is the desired result, the thing that I would want in this case. Okay. All right, so that's a simple example of how I might construct the handle of that squeegee, for example. Real simple loft between two circles. The guide sketch really determines a lot of the complex shape that's involved there. Now, moving on, if I go down here just a bit, much of this feature is pretty straightforward. Initially, the handle is constructed with a loft, but much of this part is constructed with simple sketches and extrudes. The squeegee part itself is very straightforward, and if I roll down, much of the geometry is created very easily. Simple arcs and circles and extrudes. But I will reach a point where I need to transition from my handle down to the circular profile here that's a part of the squeegee. And I do have a few sketches that I've constructed that I want to point out. In particular, sketch 16, which is just a simple rectangle. If I highlight it here, just a simple rectangle that I want to loft to. And I have a few sketch profiles, in particular, sketch 5. And the key thing with sketch 5 is it's just a circle, but it's been split into 4 pieces. So just reinforcing that idea I was talking about you a moment ago, you want to make sure that you have the same number of points. I'm lofting from this end piece of the handle to a rectangle. The rectangle has 4 vertices, so I split my circle into 4 pieces. That way I get the correct mapping. Now let me show you how this looks. And I want to deliberately not use this sketch at first, just to show you what can happen. Right? So let's hide this sketch, and let's just choose, like a new user might, this face and my sketch, which is that sketch 16. This is another great example of the twist that you might see by default. Notice that I get a lot of twist. This thing is rotating around as it goes to match up to that circle. And this is, again, because it doesn't know how to map the vertices correctly. And so this is another great example where if I just use a simple face, I don't really have control of that. However, if instead of using a face, I use that sketch I was talking about a moment ago, right, then I get a much different contour. Right? So let's do that. Let's go to sketch 5. And now, instead of lofting between the face and the rectangle, I want to loft between sketch 5, which is that circle that's split up, and sketch 16, which is the rectangle. Notice how much smoother the transition is. Just all I did there was split the circle into pieces, and notice that it's a much cleaner transition between shapes. Now, it may not still be exactly what you're looking for, and that's where we get into in conditions and guides. But a big tip, just to get it close, and it may be fine, for what you're trying to do, is just to split the sketches up. Now you can also match vertices, and this is another tip that I have. You can select, no, I want this point aligned with that point, and you can select 2 vertices and it will match them up. But it's important to point out, really, one of the biggest tips that I have is make sure for a smooth transition to split the entities up so you have the same number of vertices. It's not a requirement. It's just I would consider it a best practice. Okay, so just real quickly, jumping down here to the final loft. The reason I like to point out this loft is it's actually constructed using 4 guides. So if I roll up here, I actually have 4 guide sketches. So if I rotate this around just a bit, you'll see, and these are very explicitly defined. This is the transition I want between profiles. The question came up before, can we 3D sketch our transitions? And the answer is no, but you can absolutely construct planes and still sketch these types of shapes. Okay. And in this case, these guides are what control my finished loft. Okay, so if I roll down there, you'll see the loft is following those exact contours, those exact sketch entities. Now, I mentioned before, and by the way, just real quickly, if I edit this, you'll see guides, and then each one is selected here. Now, I mentioned before, one big tip that I have is the final button while editing a sketch, and this is very, very helpful if you have a lot of guides. Let's say, for instance, I've created this loft, but I don't like the way this guide shapes the loft, and I want to change it a little bit. You can edit the sketch, right? So we'll right-click Edit the Sketch, and you'll notice by default, of course, the feature disappears. And what a lot of new users will do is edit or move the feature, okay, go back and forth between sketch and feature. A big tip that I have is this Final button. And if you click Final, it will show you the end result. And the reason this is so cool is then I can go in, manipulate the guide, and watch the Loft update live. And so it allows me to very quickly manipulate the guide and then have it quickly update, right? Without having to create, complex shapes and go back and forth between sketch and feature. So Final, a big tip that I have. This, by the way, is not specific to lofts. Any sketch that is used in a feature will have the Final button, and you can manipulate sketch entities and watch it live update in the finished part. So again, big tip, the Final button, edit the guides, and watch the Loft update in real time. Okay, so going back, let's jump back real quickly. So I just want to reiterate, make sure that your guides are attached to each profile. So if you have several profiles, make sure that you have a coincident or Pierce constraint attaching a point on your guide to a point on your profile, or the profile in general. The guides themselves must be smooth, so make sure that you have a tangent transition. If a spline is obviously a smooth transition as well, but you do not want any sharp transitions. And the Final button can be very valuable when editing guides. It will dynamically update and allow you to manipulate your guides and watch it update live instead of going back and forth. Okay. So these are just some tips that I have for guides, and that is really what I had planned for you. I know there are many questions that I have not answered, so just be patient, please. I'm going to stick around and answer all those questions. But just real quickly, going forward, if you haven't already, try Onshape in your professional environment and let us know what you think. We've actually built a help feedback tool. So under help, you'll see feedback, and we've tried to make it very easy for you to give us feedback. You can add comments, screenshots, mark up the screen, hit send, and it automatically creates a ticket. So we've tried to make giving us any feedback that you have very simple. So please don't hesitate to use it. Give us your feedback. Also invite others and share. There's a big share icon on the top right. Really encourage you. You can collaborate in real time, so I can communicate with others in real time. I can comment inside the document. I can see each other's screens. All kinds of cool stuff comes with sharing in Onshape. The last thing I want to mention is if you're interested in meeting local users or maybe interested in establishing a user group, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to help you set things up. Now, I know there are a lot of questions, so bear with me. I'm going to stick around and answer all of them. But if you don't have any further questions, I want to say thank you, everyone, and have a good day.